people. Their stories, I think, resonate with all of us. We all have challenges, but many of the challenges that we have faced personally are pale in comparison to what we just heard. So I'd like to give it up again for them. Excited about some of the research that I'm going to be able to unveil, but I want to keep this in a historical perspective. I've identified basically 4 major waves in the influence of psilocybin mushrooms. The first wave, 200,000 to 10,000 years ago, before present BP. The second wave, 10,000 to BP to 1955. That's when they basically brought from Boston to that Maria Sabina, a Mazatec shaman in Mexico, in Oaxaca. The third wave, 1956 to 1999, I'll explain that. And the fourth wave that we're involved in today. Now, we are the paradigm shift. There is no doubt about it. And with Rick Goblin's and Leanna's leadership with MAPS, we are the tip of piercing the envelope into what I think will be substantial. I say this with, I think, great gravitas and credibility. Here are the current clinical studies going on at major universities on psilocybin mushrooms today. So I'll briefly explain the mushroom life cycle. Many of you know this, that spores are being generated from mushrooms. Mushrooms are called fruit bodies. Spores are typically sexual. We have to have a mating pair in order to come together. The downstream mycelium, once it joins together, is then binucleate, that's 2 nuclei per cell, and then the mycelium grows. And that period of time the mycelium can grow can be literally decades, sometimes hundreds of years. Oftentimes, much shorter than that. But here is a 5 days of Psilocybin commences growing out. It's a network-based organism. It's constantly forking and dividing. The largest organism in the world is the mycelial mat in eastern Oregon, 2,200 acres in size. 1,665 football fields to a depth of about 3 feet, and it's 1 cell wall thick. We have several skin layers that protect us from the infection. The mycelium on the other side is many hostile microorganisms that love to consume it. How is that possible? How is it possible that the largest organism in the world known today is a mycelial mat, 2,200 acres in size, and only 1 cell wall thick? It's because it's producing extracellular metabolites, messenger molecules, antivirals, antibiotics, all sorts of elaborate communication molecules that are being exuded into the environment. And from those reactions, the receptor fields on the outside of the mycelial networks is able to code for new enzymes and new defensive strategies. So when you look at the mycelium, there is no one specific place this mycelium can be damaged. It's a network designed organism. On the right is a root of a matsutake. This is a matsutake mycelium, a pine mushroom, and that is a root that surfaces when there's enough humidity and moisture, and it comes to the top of the soil. Now, under 4 primary environmental stimuli, the mushroom mycelium is triggered into mushroom formation. Introduction of water, rain, we all know that. Evaporation, and evaporation causes cooling, so dropping of temperature. The mycelium comes to the surface, exhales carbon dioxide, inhales oxygen. That's the 4th one. It's surprisingly light. The 99% of all mushrooms require exposure to light. So this is really important because when psilocybin mushrooms are exposed to light, then they typically start coding for the production of psilocybin. So here's the Psilocybin commences primordial in a petri dish. Looking at one of my standard electron micrographs, the mushrooms begin to be elicited from the mycelial mat. And specifically light in the 320 to 400 nanometer range stimulates the production of psilocybin and psilocin. This is really interesting because a lot of the lenticulous psilocybin mushrooms, the ones that grow on wood, like Psilocybe cyanescens and Psilocybe azurescens, Beta cystis, Sarcoidolis, etc., they don't produce any psilocybin in culture, in petri dish, until they're exposed to blue light. So this is why it's very interesting because you can analyze the mycelium and there's no psilocybin. Now that's not true with Psilocybe cubensis. Some of those cultures do turn bluish in absence of blue light. But many of the wood decomposing psilocybin mushrooms do. There's about 240 species of psilocybin mushrooms currently identified. There's about 14,000 species currently identified by science with Latin binomials, and a genome of about 150,000 species of mushrooms that are out there that we estimate, and a larger genome in the fungal kingdom of about 1.5 million species. Fungi outnumber plants around 6 to 1. So these things are really resident in our ecosystem. Psilocybin cubensis is the most commonly cultivated psilocybin mushroom in the world, the most commonly ingested one. But these mushrooms come up, and they really don't have a good immune system. They come up very quickly in 4 or 5 days, and then begin to rot. They expose themselves, and they attract microbes, humans, animals, insects. They engage the animal kingdom to move them around. This is not by happenstance, this is by design. So looking at the mushrooms now begin to decompose a few days later, this is not Psilocybin cubensis, and then spores germinate. Germination of spores then create mycelium, and then very quickly it goes subterranean. And so my foot covers about 8 miles, in a single cubic inch, there can be about 8 miles of mycelium, but my foot is covering about 300 miles of mycelium. So these are resident organisms in the ecosphere that are literally under every footstep that we take. And I suggest and propose to you, and I know this is true, when you walk across mycelial membranes with every footstep you take, hundreds of miles underneath each footstep, they are aware, they know you are there, they are sensitive, and in the aftermath of your footsteps, as you create new food by breaking wood or crunching the soil, it exposes fractal surfaces, the mycelium surges up, develop up. So they have a vested interest in migration, and they follow the migration patterns of animals, especially humans. The mycelium conforms to the same archetype of that shared by the computer internet. Now, there are some things in life which I think are implicitly true. And this comes from my visions on high doses of psilocybin. I've been speaking about this for a long time, but I know it's true. So I want to present to you something that I think is a universal truth of nature and of existence today. We will go to the beginning of the universe 13.8 billion years ago. Now, this is from the Max Planck Institute. 1 parsec is 3.2 light years. You go out 15.6 megaparsecs, and you look at the structure of the universe, and it conforms to the mycelial archetype. This archetype is resonant at different orders of magnitude. Spatially, even the organization of dark matter, it also conforms to the same archetype shared by the mycelium, shared by the computer internet. And then we look at when the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Soon thereafter, the planet Theia came and crashed into the Earth. Enormous amounts of debris jettisoned, and then that coalesced into the moon. Many evolutionary biologists believe the presence of the moon and then liquid water on our planet created an interface environment on the beaches. And this then allowed for the migration of life coming from the oceans on the land. The first common ancestor known so far, a single organism, is called Luca. The last universal common ancestor, 13.8 billion years ago. It was a single-celled organism. But just recently, this is now 1.4 billion years later, it takes a long time for life to evolve. The first evidence of a multicellular organism is the form of mycelium found in lava beds in South Africa 2.4 billion years ago. I believe matter gets life, life becomes single cells then become strings then fork, networks begin, networks then collaborate and compete, and then start microbiomes, and then giant guilds of communities are created, set by the stage of mycelial networks, as the foundation of the food web. We split from fungi 650 million years ago. Mycelium gave birth to animals. We are all descendants of mycelial networks. Think about it. The largest organism on the planet was this fossil discovered in 1843 called Protophytes. For over 100 years, they couldn't determine what it was. This is before trees, before woody plants, before flying insects, and they were about 30 to 40 feet long, standing up. And so Pernix was the tallest organism on land 420 million years ago. It was determined by Dr. Kevin Boyce, at the University of Chicago, after a series of excellent articles that was challenged and that had restated arguments and did more research, but proved definitively across the planet, the tallest organism on land were giant fungi. These would then attract lightning, epigenetically, it become a rich resource and a place for rapid evolution and the stimulation. Lightning strikes, the microbiomes are being created, the pressure evolutionarily. And so we go forward from 420 million years ago to 250 million years ago, and we have a visitor from the outer space. We have an asteroid that comes crashing into the Earth, slams into the Earth, the great concussion, enormous amounts of debris fields jettisoned into the atmosphere, light is cut off, animals and plants die, the great extinction at the PT boundary. This extinction event then meant that enormous debris fields then were gobbled up by fungi. In fact, the predominant fungus has been given a name, Reduciosporinitis. It's at the interface at the PT boundary, the Permian-Triassic boundary. And so we go forward now from the 250 million years ago extinction event, and then in Brazil, about 2-3 years ago, a fully intact fossilized mushroom, which are very hard to find on fossil record because obviously it decomposed so long. Because of the silica, the sediments in this Brazilian plain, this mushroom was given the name Gondwana agaricides, and it is a mushroom that is fully formed. This is important that you know. When you look at Psilocybin cubensis, when you ingest these mushrooms, you are ingesting ancient organisms who had their form long before we had ours. So we advance forward again to 65 million years ago, and we have another celestial visitor. And we all know about this one. 65 million years ago, impacted above the Yucatan, enormous amounts of debris fields jettisoned into the atmosphere again, sunlight is cut off, dinosaurs become extinct, thank God. And massive extinction and fungi re-inherited the Earth. So there's a recurring lesson. Those organisms that pair with fungi during extinction events had a better chance of survival. We're in a wonderful Earth today, but now we're involved in 6X, the sixth greatest extinction event known in the history of life on this planet. And this is the call to action. This is the call to arms that I hear when I am under the influence and going on a sacred journey with psilocybin mushrooms. The Earth is calling out to us. Don't you see? Don't you hear? We all are on this spaceship together. You have a sacred responsibility to be the custodian of our biodiversity and to protect it. And that's a theme I think a lot of us are getting, is how we are embedded within the fabric of nature. 40% of all the species on this planet are directly threatened with imminent extinction. There's about 8.3 million species estimated on this planet. 30,000 species are going extinct per year. Do the math. In 100 years, that's more than 30% of the species that got us here today. In 100 years, this is not an asteroid impact, but from a geological perspective, it may as well be. The fact that we live provincially with our narrow bandwidth of our lifespan eclipses us from seeing the obviousness of the impact that's happening now. This impact is not caused by an asteroid. It's caused by an organism. It's caused by us. Not only are we the cause of this extinction event, but we likely to be its victim. I've been doing a lot of work, as many of you know, with bees. I've done great research on that. Look at this study that came out in 2017. 75% decline in 27 years in total flying insect biomass in Europe, in a protected area, not an industrialized area, in a nature preserve. Many of you may remember in the 60s and 70s, when you drive down the freeway, you're out in the country, bug splatter against your windshield. You know, it's hard to notice what you don't see. Now bug splatter is massively reduced because of loss of flying insects. Ecosystems are rattling under our feet and all around us, primarily due to overpopulation, pollution, and loss of biodiversity that ensues in deforestation. So it's interesting, and a lot of us share this in common. When you're fully on a psilocybin mushroom journey or ayahuasca journey, and you hear the organisms calling out to us, reaching out to us, and I often thought if there was a universal organization of organisms, otherwise called would we be voted on the planet or off the planet? Well, I think that vote's happening now. But from using psilocybin and these other substances, there is a pro-environmental influence on our attitude towards nature. Someone mentioned this recently that saw an insect and didn't step on it. Thank you. You don't need to kill things. It's so important that we begin to respect our other species, our other citizens on this planet that we enjoy. So let's look again from an evolutionary point of view of the involvement of mushrooms in the evolution of humans and primates. The bull-bee monkey, his diet is 35% fungi. It eats up more than 12 times its body weight in a mushroom called Ascopolypus. Well, 22 species of primates eat mushrooms and other differences, edible and poisonous ones. 23, including humans, were primates. So that speaks to me from a deep evolutionary past of knowledge of our intersection of primates with mushrooms as a food source, as a medicine. So there's an unexplained rapid expansion of the human brain. 2 million years ago to 200,000 years ago. There's a large spectrum because the data fields are not highly populated. But we do know that suddenly the human brain that led the Homo sapiens from Homo erectus and the other primates suddenly enlarged. It's really interesting because it happened during a time of rapid climate change that we're seeing now. Homo erectus and Neanderthals migrated from Africa into Europe way before Homo sapiens did. Homo sapiens had 2 migrations, 200,000 years ago it failed, 40,000 years ago it happened. And within 4,000 years of contact, we made Neanderthals extinct. Homo erectus became extinct before that. Some people have done 23andMe, I'm a 3% Neanderthal. Can't tell. But I think this is interesting that the enlargement of the human brain allowed us to prognosticate, to predict, to store food, to make calculations that led to better survival and better competition. So there is, Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna proposed the stone age theory. The idea is our hominid ancestors, because of climate change, came out and went to the savannah for the forest, walked across the plains, and what do primates do when they're hunting? They look for footprints, they look for scat. You find these bodacious mushrooms. You're inclined to consume them, you're hungry, you share them with your family. And then this happened not once, not twice, not 10 times, not 100 times, not 1,000,000 times, hundreds of millions of times over millions and millions of years. If you know about epigenetic theory, the idea that stimulus from the environment can code genomically new expressions, this is a plausible explanation for the split in the evolution of Homo sapiens from the hominid tree. Look how large these mushrooms are. On elephant dung, hippopotamus, zebra, horse, buffalo, cow. So you're tracking animals, you're hungry, you find these things that are fleshy, they look edible. The likelihood of consumption is not remote, it's a high probability. And because of such repetition, having this experience bonds the family together, bonds the clan together. The stars open up the wonders of the universe, the empathetic properties you develop for your kin, the kindness you express. This builds community. But I disagree with Terence and Dennis. It's not a theory. is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess. A theory is a hypothesis that's been proven with factual data. But that might be changing. So, as much criticism that is well deserved towards Terence McKenna, and Terence and I became very good friends the last few years of his life, especially starting making fun of himself. But I think there's a great thread of truth. I think there's a fundamental truth that Terence and Dennis have postulated. Now, go forward to 70,000 years ago, this is a cave art that I'm going to be showing you. The first image you'll see is the actual cave art from the Sicilian Endurance Plateau, 7,000 years BD, before present. And then it's overlaid by an artist, a friend of mine, Jonathan Reeder. So this is the actual pictograph in northern Algeria. And then to make it more visible, true to form, this is the famous bee man. It has been well known in Mesoamerica and Mexico to put magic mushrooms in honey. Many of you know that. But did you know that mushrooms and honey was a practiced tradition throughout Europe until 1560, when under the pressure of the Catholic Church, the Bavarian Beer Purity Act specifically banned mushrooms and henbane and other plants from being added to beer. And in doing so, I think it was a war against the pagan indigenous cultures of Europe, who were celebrating in the woods, in contact with nature. Orthodox religion created churches, they had gatekeepers, they had tithing and funding and institution, and they were the gatekeepers between you and the infinite. This structured organization of monotheism committed war against indigenous peoples. So in the Sicilian Endurance Plateau, there's not one of these images, there's 6 of them. That's been what I've read. There's also this very curious pictograph that's been redrawn here to make it clearer. It's quite clear what the intention of the artist is. Those are not spores, I think they're ideas, right? They're flowing between the mushrooms and eliciting dance and hilarity. In Spain, this is postulated to be in connection with philosophy Marii. This is from 6,000 years BP. Taxonomically correct images of mushrooms in the cave art in Spain. We go to about 400 years BCE, 2400 BP, and Demeter is presenting Persephone, a mushroom, before she consumes it and goes into the underworld. And that, in Greek mythology, was the onset of winter. So, a fantastic connectogram made by Dr. Robert Harris, many of you have seen this, and it shows the interconnectivity of neural networks within the human brain. Now, Nancy Reagan, if you were here today, there is your brain without drugs. Neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, and having more network connections for you to be able to make smarter decisions. And so, looking at the effect of the neurogenesis, the extinction of the trace sphere conditioning, it's been shown that, in this case, mice experiments, that when the mice were put into a cage and the floor was electrified, they would get a tone first, and 46 seconds later, the floor was electrified, they got shocked. And then after hearing the tone, electrocution 40 seconds later, the mice very quickly realized the tone was associated with punishment. They'd hear the tone and they'd cower in fear. And so when they dosed mice with psilocybin, they could actually see the extinction of the trace fear conditioning. And what's so interesting, and I'll repeat this again later on, is that when they tried to break that trace fear conditioning under the influence of psilocybin, under high doses of psilocybin, it took 10 repetitions or more to dissociate the expected shock with the tone, which means that the tone occurred, no shock. So 10 cycles before the mice disassociated the tone with fear. Under low doses of psilocybin, microdosing, it only took 2.
extinction of the fear conditioned response is something that's really important. Think of that if you're our ancestors fighting saber-toothed tigers or cave bears, slaughtered up against a huge adversary. You know, you're traumatized, you have PTSD, you eat these mushrooms, you bond as a community, you go back. Well, that means then that psilocybin induces, we know, neurogenesis, it induces courage, it can extinction of the fear-based conditioned response, and it induces kindness. These are leadership skills. I know a few leaders who could really benefit we have examples here today that leads to better citizenship. People are more responsible, they care more for their families, for their communities, they want to do outreach to help other people who are disadvantaged. So my career with psilocybin mushrooms began very early. And these are my 4 professors who helped me enormously. Dr. Alexander Smith in the top right, Kiss Gates in the lower right, Daniel Stuntz, and then lower left, Dr. Michael Butte. It's interesting because these were really conservative people, except for Michael Butte. And when I was 19 years of age and I first met them, this is what I looked like. I don't have as much hair now. But I want to reflect on some of the activities that have led up to conferences just like this. In 1977, we had a great psilocybin mushroom expedition. And Dr. Gastrick was on, and we went from Southern Oregon into British Columbia, collecting samples for the monograph of the genus Psilocybin. So Gary Metzer, Stephen Pollack, myself, Dale Leslie, and Gastrick was one, and Gary Metzer. Michael Butte had 3 students, Jonathan Ott, Jeremy Goodwin, and myself. Many of you know who Jonathan Ott is. Between us, we wrote 17 books by my count on psychoactive plants and mushrooms. This nerdy professor, but he was also an expert in psilocybin chemistry and challenged in court and had overthrown many cases brought by the DEA against possession and cultivation of psilocybin mushrooms. It was inaccurate protocols that he then published in scientific literature how to actively do that. He applied for a DEA license, we got it, and so my work was covered for more than 10 years by the Forest Administration license. But I was absolutely paranoid. Everybody approached me as an underground DEA agent as far as I was concerned. So we kind of hunkered down, and we had all sorts of locks in our laboratories, but it allowed me to grow because I couldn't find these mushrooms in the wintertime for my electron microscopy, so of course I'd have to grow them. Lots of them. Because, you know, specimen preparation techniques fail, and how do I know if they're actually active unless I bioassay them? All these academic questions have to have the answer. I can tell you a lot behind those words. But then, so Terence McKenna, Andy Weil, Gary Mentzer, and Stephen Pollack. So that was in 1976. Then I cut my hair, 1977 to 1979. A lot of people want to know what happened. I have 2 black belts. I was going up for my black belt training, September 15th, 1979. I got my first black belt. And when you're wrestling and grappling, the martial arts style that I was doing, having a ponytail is not a good idea, right? So I had to cut my hair for that. But we started doing these mushroom conferences, the mycomedia conferences. And we did them for more than 40 years, a series of conferences that evolved. And the 1999 Millennium Mushroom Conference, since I knew the Merry Pranksters, a lot of people in the Grateful Dead scene, Ken Kesey, and then because I also knew Sasha Shulgin and Andy Weil and Terence McKenna and all these psychoactive chemists and experts, I realized, wow, I kind of know them both. So I brought them together and brought Further, the bus from the Merry Pranksters, Ken Kesey, and the gang showed up. And we had the Millennium Mushroom Conference that we lost control of because 130, 140 people end up tripping. I totally lost control of the conference, and there's a great photograph, I don't have it in the slideshow, where we had about a dozen psilocybin mushroom species in a giant witch's brew, and we all consumed it at this conference, and it was on Halloween, and so Sasha Shulgin and Andy Weil and all these incredible people, Ann Shulgin, presented, in costume, and we had the most amazing psychedelic mushroom party that you can imagine. And the next day I said, I'm done. I can't take responsibility for this. This is at a time that was really, really sensitive legally to do things like this. So Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters were a major influence on the psychedelic mushroom movement, electric acid Kool-Aid tests by Tom Wolfe. Many of you have read that. Ken Kesey, George Walker took over after Neil Cassidy. Jack Kerouac's On the Road was about Neil Cassidy, the Merry Pranksters, and Ken Kesey. They went to New York, met Ram Dass and Timothy Leary. That didn't work out so well. But anyhow, so there's the West Coast, East Coast influences here. But Ken and I became very good friends, and so I made this chainsaw oil for him because both of us like to eat chainsaws. So I put several 100 million spores of Psilocybe azurescens into chainsaw oil, Sporus illuminatus, Omnis Psilocybe munda, psilocybe mushrooms throughout the world. It's all natural chainsaw, and it's the Merry Prankster chainsaw. So when Ken was cutting his trees, he was inoculating psilocybe mushrooms in his forest. It works, folks. You should try it, okay? A number of books then came out. So I have 4 books at that time, and here the most interesting book by far was The Golden Guide to Hallucinogenic Plants, what every 10-year-old needs to know, and for part of our higher education. There's quite the story behind that as well. It came out 1 edition. The PTAs of America, of course, rose up to say this was an affront to the educational system of the United States, but many of us were cheering this along. And many of us were involved in what I call the Psilocybe cubensis Scholarship Fund. And this is basically people were growing psilocybe mushrooms in their closets to pay for college tuition. So colleges throughout the world, especially the United States and Europe, the students would be growing psilocybin mushrooms. No one was getting rich. They were just reinvesting money in the community. So I went on to publish 4 new species in the genus Psilocybe azurescens, Liniformis variety americana, Psilocybe wileyi, and Psilocybe sonarfibulosa. Now, Psilocybe stuntzii was named after Daniel Stuntz, Psilocybe cyanescens, and Psilocybe elenii. They grow in Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, down to Northern California. They could grow in wood chips, and this is indeed a problem because Gallerana autumnalis marginata, which is deadly poisonous and contains the cyclopeptides, the same ones in Amanita phalloides and verosa, the destroying angels, these are extremely deadly toxins. And when I saw this fruiting of Psilocybe stuntzii and Gallerana marginata side by side, I thought, oh my gosh, education is really important. So still to this day, it's really important that you understand how to identify mushrooms. And one of the big concerns I have with the surge of the interest in psilocybe mushrooms is the quote-unquote chain of custody and identification of the mushrooms that you're receiving. I met a wonderful lady who had a very adverse experience with psilocybe mushrooms. I kind of delved into it, and I think a lot of these adverse experiences are related to food poisoning. The mushrooms are rotting. People who are growing these mushrooms are trying to make their weight. It's kind of a drug phrase. They're trying to make their kilo. They're trying to make their pound. And so they pick aborted, dirty mushrooms to throw it into the bag so they can make their weight. Well, those mushrooms are soured. They're covered with bacteria. You ingest those mushrooms, and you can get high, yes, but you also get a tremendous GI upset and distress. That makes for a very bad experience. Psilocybe semilanciata, Psilocybe pelliculosa. Semilanciata are liberty caps that grow in the pastures. Pelliculosa is a woodland species that grows along trails. And so a number of clinical studies began, and Roland Griffith and I communicated this morning, and he applied for his first clinical study from Johns Hopkins to the Food and Drug Administration in 1999. But it was 2006 where he made his first publication, and subsequently many other ones. So it's interesting because, as many of you know, that the patients reported long after the experience, it was one of the most significant spiritual experiences in their lives. This study, about 30% of the people had a negative experience. But what's interesting is that the positive benefits of the clinical study of this patient who had a good experience carried over 14 months later. The 30% of the people who had a negative experience, the negativity of the experience did not extend beyond the experience itself. That, I thought, was quite surprising. A number of other studies have come out looking at big data sets. This is a really interesting one of prisoners. 480,000 people were surveyed. And they found, now association is not necessarily causation, but it can be. So this is extraordinary. When they did the survey and their data mining, they found that those people who had psilocybin use, there's a 27% decrease odds of larceny and theft, 22% decrease odds of property crime, 18% decrease odds for a violent crime. Look at the societal benefits of this. In my own family right now, I'm enormously challenged with my son. And he's just got out of prison. And seeing how the court system works, he's in prison for drugs, for heroin, and seeing how inefficient it is, how the people get sucked into the system and they churn them. It's an industry. And the delays and the cost of society for the court costs, the law enforcement costs, the cost of the families, the grief it causes, the training of prisoners to become criminals because they're in contact with career criminals who are dangerous. That cost of society is huge. When you look at studies like this and you realize that psilocybin use reduces crime, the return on investment for our society, even by the most conservative fiscal managers, this should be looked upon as a very valuable investment. The psychedelic use, this is out of British Columbia, 1,266 community members, ages 16 to 70. And interestingly, that there was a negative correlation of psilocybin use with partner-to-partner violence. But the partner-to-partner violence was just between men and their partner. It did not extend to women. So if a man had psilocybin use in their past, they tend to be less violent. So I often thought in the dating apps, maybe you should have you used psilocybin? Yes, hey, I like the person. I kid you not. So, and then the emotional face recognition, the people were able to reconnect with their emotions. This is just a list of some of the clinical studies. A reset mechanism is proposed for treatment-resistant depression. This is what Compass has been approved for now, USONA as well. And then for general psychiatric disorders. Now this gets to be kind of chaotic in a sense. There's so many positive implications from psychedelic use. And one I find particularly interesting is the pro-democracy influence. That people who use psilocybin mushrooms tend to develop anti-authoritarian attitudes. Again, I think the entire United States population would well benefit from high doses of psilocybin, but I'm not going to say that. So Roland Griffiths and Johns Hopkins suggested that psilocybin be removed from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 4, basically asthma medicine. There's no potential for abuse. The clinical studies are highly controlled in hospital environments. I understand that. Consistent setting, standardize the protocol, medical care with skilled medical practitioners and physicians. This is the tripping room, basically, where over 750 patients have been supervised with under psilocybin. But it's really interesting. When I visited Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, and I went to the room, I saw that mushroom stone. I go, where did you get that? And he goes, someone gave it to us. Well, it turns out that my friend and myself, we made 30 of these, and our mushroom stone was in the sessions for over 700 people, and so I feel like I was there, So I met Michael Pollan. Many of you have read his book. He's got 40 pages on me. I'm still upset at him for revealing my sacred mushroom patch. He told me he would not reveal it, but he said, Paul Stamets will not tell me where the mushroom patch is that he's going to take me to, but there are 3 parks on the Columbia River. 2 of them have yurts, and we stayed in one of them. Don't trust a journalist with confidentiality. But I did tell Michael, I believe psilocybin mushrooms changed my mind. And I went, it's interesting the book came out on that. But microdosing is something that is now rampant, and I think it deserves a lot of attention. And I think it speaks to epigenetic neurogenesis, what I think hominids experienced in the increase of the human brain. And I believe it's so important that we invent ourselves out of this crisis. We need more neurons. We need better thinkers. We need to inspire generations to come up with solutions to be able to offset the dangerous course of the 6X extinction that we're experiencing. So USONA is now recruiting for treatment-resistant depression. I think these studies are excellent. They're expensive. You have to have an entire institution of a medical facility involved. The nurses, the secretaries, the doctors, the therapists. There are teams of people, and that's good. I'm absolutely in favor of that. But lots of us are depressed, but not clinically depressed. Lots of us want to be happier and more creative. I believe if you're happier and more creative, then you do things, you write, you do paintings. The next day you're excited to go back to that painting or that writing. Because it breeds more creativity and happiness. When you're depressed, you're not as creative. You kind of spiral down into depression. You can change the course of your psychological health by microdosing or by tripping. I think there's a big spectrum between microdosing and macrodosing. It's a subject of debate. But I think microdosing has a lot of potential. This is a species that I published, Psilocybin azurescens, the most potent psilocybin mushroom in the world. It has up to 2% psilocybin, being a prodrug to psilocin. It has psilocybin and psilocin. And so I resisted showing this for a number of years until this past year, but I'm going to show you something that really excites me. So we have a short movie here.
Greetings, and meet Psilocybin azurescens. Psilocybin azurescens is probably one of the most potent mushrooms in the world. It contains psilocybin and psilocin up to 2% of its dried mass. Now think of that. 2% of the dried mass of this mushroom are psychoactive crystals. Why would a mushroom produce so much? We don't know, but it certainly has attracted the interest of humans. The bluing that you see here is a bruising reaction. It's indicative of psilocin as it degrades. And the more bluing you see, the more psilocin there once was. Now, psilocybin dephosphorylates into psilocin, and when you ingest these mushrooms, psilocin becomes a serotonin antagonist. It means that the psilocybin or the psilocin becomes a temporary neurotransmitter, opening up the floodgates of the senses. Now, this mushroom is sinuous. It's got a sinuous stem, which means it bends back and forth. It's bluing very, very strongly, and it has these very indicative spore color here on the annular zone. And the spore color is purple-brown, and the mushrooms are bluish. Those two features in combination pretty much de facto determines its psilocybin. Now look how bodacious the rhizomorphs are at the base of the stem. This is a large psilocybin, by far the largest one that I know that grows on wood chips in the Pacific Northwest. It is now a popular one to have in your backyard. It's just fun. It's just naturalized in the woods here. And this is a beautiful fruiting of them. And the psilocybins, many of the woodland psilocybins have this chestnut brown to caramel color. This one is unique in that it's got these umbos, and it's a broad umbo, and the cap is very circular. The bruising reactions just from impact of rain, perhaps. This mushroom is one of the most fascinating and interesting ones to grow. Those who choose to partake of this mushroom should be warned. These are exceptionally potent, and oftentimes they can cause temporary paralysis, loss of muscle control. So that is not a good thing. It seems that most people who boil this mushroom in hot water, those symptoms seem to be alleviated. But this is clearly a sacred species, and I love just personally touching it. This is not a mushroom that I enjoy eating. It's almost too potent for me. But it is a species that I greatly admire. I love touching it. I love handling it. I love seeing it. And it's a great indicator of the habitat in my magical mushroom forest that is very conducive to spiritual experiences.
Now, one of those mushrooms are two heroic journeys, okay? They're really, really potent, so be forewarned. But having your mushrooms in your own backyard, really low risk. that come up. I mean, how often do you really need the trip, right? And I also feel, and I have a phrase, nature provides, I don't, because I feel responsible if I give psilocybin mushrooms to somebody else and they have a bad trip, and I'm not with them. So I hope people hear me on this. It's really important that we take ownership and we're good custodians of this knowledge. So psilocybe cyanescens and azurescens look similar, but azurescens is huge. And so it took me a number of years to come up with this technique, and it's cold water extraction. Chopping up the mushrooms and putting them in ice cubes on top, then putting them in your refrigerator and letting the ice cubes thaw over 3 or 4 days. And you make blue juice. And that blue juice can be put into ice cube trays, and you can have blue ice cubes for Burning Man. So we just got this research results back. I only have a few minutes now, but this is from an analog of psilocybin and psilocin that's totally legal, and it shows a substantial increase in nerve growth factors. This is done in triplicate, and this analog is perfectly legal, but it has almost no measurable toxicity, but it spikes neurogenesis in terms of nerve growth factor. Another mushroom is lion's mane. Lots of reports on lion's mane. 2 clinical studies out there showing the regeneration of myelin on the axons of nerves, and remyelination, leads to better neurotransmission. Alzheimer's patients develop amyloid plaques, and in these studies with mice and also the clinical studies, there's good evidence that lion's mane mushrooms remove amyloid plaques and cause regeneration of myelin. This is so important for dementia. And so in a study that we also did looking at pluripotent stem cells, the lion's mane mycelium also incited neurite proliferation and outgrowth. So these 2 mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms and lion's mane, putting them together, I think merits a lot of some study here clinically. Now, this study is important with mice. It was the low doses of psilocybin that extinguished the conditioned fear response that I mentioned before and tended to increase neurogenesis. The high doses did not increase neurogenesis. Think of that. So I propose a nootropic vitamin complex, a stacking formula, stacking psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin. And I just like to ask, how many people in the 60s and 70s and 80s heard that if you had a bad trip and you took niacin, that you would come down from the trip? Can you have a show of hands? I'd say about 7 or 8 people. This is very common. Now, niacin, the reason why I'm stacking it with niacin is for microdosing with 200 milligrams of niacin in one capsule. If someone tried to take 10 of those capsules, it'd be 2 grams of niacin. The itching reaction, the flushing reaction would be so adverse as to discourage abuse. So the idea of microdosing to get something over the counter, also the excitation of the nerve endings will drive the psilocybin and lion's mane constituents to the endpoints of the nervous system. Neuropathies oftentimes present themselves as a deadening of the nerves of the fingertips and the toes. If the vascular system is still intact, the psilocybin then will get to the extremities. So it has multiple purposes. It's also a vasodilator. So for those 3 reasons, I think stacking with niacin could allow for the universality of use of microdosing across the counter. And if the FDA is approving these other studies, stacking with niacin and offering it well below the threshold of an experience, I think, is meritable. And very popular to make chocolates. The Aztecs were onto something. And so for the first time, I'm going to introduce a new app for microdosing. Ismail and Kaylin are here from Quantified Citizen. I have no financial interest in this app. My friend, Dr. Pam Crisco, and I have been offering suggestions. So this is important that you memorize. This app has a sign-up, and is for measuring microdosing. It's 100% anonymous on this study. And let's see if I can move this forward. It's anonymized, and come on, there it goes. Okay, so you have a disclaimer and you get, it's a two-step verification system. It talks about what you've been using, And then it has a series of tests on cognition, and it indicates, what you're stacking with. You have a memory test of, in this case, flowers lighting up, and then you have to remember and recode it. You get scored. It also has audio functionality, so you can listen to different tones and different frequencies. It can create baselines. It also has visual acuity for measuring this. It has about 30 or 40 endpoints right now. And so I recommend that you check out this app at microdosestudy.com. They're out of British Columbia. These are two really bright and smart coders whose heart's in the right direction. They have no affiliation with any commercial entity. They're a standalone company, and so I applaud their work. And this is something also creates a baseline, even if you're not doing any stacking. What is your progression towards dementia over your life? Think about we create enormous data sets, and then we look for signal from the noise. And then these data sets that will be available for people looking for clinical studies can direct the clinical studies based on these massive data sets. The idea is to get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people involved in this app that you can use. I also populate this website, mushroomreferences.com. I put it up for physicians and researchers. It's unbranded. There's no advertisements, nothing associated with me except, I've created this. I have hundreds of pages now of peer-reviewed references. So if you go to mushroomreferences.com, you want to see the research articles on psilocybin. You put in psilocybin for disease complexes, for different mushroom species, and you're going to very quickly get to the source. Physicians are so busy, they need to get to the data as quickly as possible. So the lion's mane references are there as well. So I just want to close with 2 or 3 more slides here. This is an erudite species of psilocybin mushrooms called Gymnopolis luteifolius. It's extremely rare. It grows on alder trees in the Northwest. Well, so I thought it only grew on alder trees.
And it only shows on boats. Okay, this is July 8th, 2011, and it's just hard to believe that Paul Stamets' boat will be growing a psychoactive mushroom, but it's true. I know it's not the best specimen right now, but this is Gymnopolis luteifolius. It is unique to alder. It's a very rare species. In fact, most mycologists would not be able to identify it. I just happen to have a specialty in this area. And it's so weird because my friend Clay here, hey Clay, he said he found a mushroom going off of a boat and he brought it to me from your friend, right?
At Harstein Island boat launch.
And it was also Gymnopolis luteifolius. So it begs the question now, is this mushroom indigenous to Northwest boats? And I've never found this in the wild. I've seen it at a mycological society, but go figure. Now, I'm not going to pick it, so I guess I'm not breaking the law. Or am I breaking the law because it's growing here and I know what it is? I don't know what to do. Anyhow, how bizarre. Gymnopolis luteifolius on Stamets' boat, and we've had more than one sighting of this on this boat, and more than one boat now, 2 boats. So, go figure.
I would not show this until I sold the boat, okay? But I didn't tell the people what they also got, so they're going to have to find out on their own. But I wonder if the pilgrims or other logs or other boats coming over from Europe, and they would break them apart to build houses. Those were mycelial footprints that are involved also. So this is where science fact is weirder than science fiction. I want all of you to remember July of 2033, because that's when I propose we have a party. It's been recently discovered that cicadas become infected. The male cicadas get infected. If you've been into a cicada outbreak, every 17 years, massive amounts of cicadas. I was 10 years old when I saw my cicada outbreak. And as they get old, they get fuzzy butts. And the mycelium rots out the genitals, of the male genitals, and the butt. And then also the mycelium produces an amphetamine as well as psilocybin. And the potent dose of both, the male cicadas then mimic a female seduction dance and get close to other males so the spores can spread, infect those other males, and they go into the ground, and this Massospora cicadina then is resident in the ecosystem. Another example that fungi control the behavior of animals. So it's been suggested that many of us myconauts, specialists in fungi, are being controlled by the fungi. I dare not dispute that. So I love this. The year 2033, and I love this quote in the article, scientists advise against consuming hypersexual zombie cicadas infected with psychoactive fungus. Okay, folks, Louis Schwartzberg and I have produced a movie. This is 2 minutes on fantastic fungi. He asked me to close this. Ladyburg Wildlife Center on the 7th here in Austin is featuring this movie. He's 12 years in production, so just 2-minute little closer here, and then I'm done.
My mission is to discover the language of nature, and I believe nature is intelligent.
There is a world under the earth, full of magic and mystery. It holds the consciousness of nature's connection to all living things.
You know, these mushrooms, they can heal you, they can feed you, they can kill you.
It's not like a vegetable, and it's not like an animal, but it's somewhere in between.
They support life, they convert life.
As you're walking, there's about 300 miles of fungi under every footstep that you take, and that's all over the world.
The bulk of the organism is growing underground, and it's composed of these long threads called a mycelium.
Almost everyone knows about the computer internet. The mycelium shares the same network design.
It's amazing what we don't know about mushrooms. They really are a frontier of knowledge.
You can filter water. You can create medicinal compounds almost on demand.
They have incredible capacity to make things change very quickly. So I am super hopeful.
The psychedelic members of the mushroom kingdom are fascinating.
I have been a guide for around 350 psilocybin sessions.
The most glorious part was that it made me feel more comfortable with living because you're not afraid of dying.
We need to have a paradigm shift in our consciousness. What will it take to achieve that?
We can heal the planet. We can build the future. And our world is fantastic.
My descendants, and I hope you do also. There's no time for us to show a better way and to take leadership. I want to thank Maps, Rick Godwin, Leanna, and all of you. So take it.